Think the strange, mysterious story of the Shroud of Turin couldn't possibly get stranger or more mysterious? Think again. I'll be right back. Hey there, Gracious Gang. It's Mike from The Gracious Guest here. GraciousGuest.org is the website. And, of course, the YouTube channel. If you're watching this right now, you already know about it because you're here. But you might not be subscribed, and you want to do that right now. So please, click down there right now, subscribe to the channel. Make sure you share this episode. Make sure you share this channel far and wide. If you're listening to this particular episode through our podcast, which I do through Podbean, and basically it's available through, if you're not aware, through every possible mainstream podcast aggregator out there. So Podbean, Stitcher, Apple, of course, a lot of people get it through there, Google Podcasts, Spotify, you name it. So I actually had a student, shout out to Anne-Marie out there, by the way, who just said she discovered this, I believe, through Spotify. So it's working, everybody. Again, this is the channel where we kind of explore all things truth, goodness, and beauty, highlighting, showcasing wonder and awe, and we do that through literature, through reflecting on good movies, through good food, all right, just through philosophical and theological insights that we can get through all kinds of stuff in daily life, okay? And to that end, I have to point out that by far, exponentially speaking, the most popular video I've ever released was my little overview of some of the basic findings that have been coming out about the Shroud of Turin. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this burial cloth in Turin, Italy, or Torino, where it's been for at least 700 or 800 years or so, we know for sure. Before that, the exact history of it's a little tricky, a little difficult to trace. We have to kind of piece some puzzles together. It's a really interesting mystery, but it has long been held to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, the actual cloth that Jesus was buried in and through which he resurrected. And it was debunked in the late 1980s, as we'll talk about in this interview a little bit more, but it has subsequently been, I would say, in some sense, rebunked. At least a lot of very important data that has come forth that calls for further examination. So this cloth has all kinds of crazy properties, all kinds of bizarre, very strange evidence all throughout it. And I talked about that in a previous video, the video I just mentioned, of course. So if you want to go back and check that out, please go ahead and click it here, and I've got it linked below for you to check out that overview video. By the way, you'll notice how dramatically the quality, at least video quality, of this particular show has improved since that was done. So we're kind of stepping things up around here in the Gracious Guest show. And because I want to give you guys good content, I want to reward your loyal visiting of this particular platform with, a little bit more focus on these topics that you guys seem to find interesting. So today, I decided to go deeper on this shroud topic, and we went way deeper because I was able to interview a new acquaintance, a new friend of mine, Martha May, who came to my attention through when that first YouTube video went out with all that information about the shroud. Some folks who are close to the actual shroud research reached out to me, and I'm now being brought into some conversations with people in that network, people that are much closer to it than I have been, and I'm very grateful for that. And Martha May joined me to talk about some of this, to specifically talk about another cloth where we spent most of our time today talking about the Sudarium Christi. The Sudarium is kept in Oviedo, Spain. We have a much more ancient, undisputed sort of track record of that cloth's location. And now what that cloth is and how it relates to the shroud, I don't want to spoil because we're going to get into that in the interview. But Martha was able to visit this recently on pilgrimage. She went to pilgrimage, or went on pilgrimage in Portugal and Spain, and managed to get to see the Sudarium Christi, which is awesome. So she's going to share a little bit about that. Martha, she's retired from a career in really higher ed facilities. She has a background in accounting, management, and MBA. All sorts of cool background that was her career, as she said, her occupation, and now her vocation is really following this passion that developed when she was a high school student in the late 1970s and heard about the Shroud of Turin and really became convinced of its authenticity and followed through the years developments with the research of the Shroud and then the Sudarium as well, which we'll get into, of course. And she recently just completed in the last couple of years, I didn't know this was a thing, by the way, until I talked to her, let me get this right, a postgraduate certificate in Shroud Studies through the Pontifical Athenaeum in Rome, which she did, which is awesome. So she's actually pursued a postgraduate certificate in Shroud Studies. How cool is that? Okay, so what an amazing guest to have on, a new friend of the Gracious Guest Show. I have a feeling that it won't be the last time that she'll be appearing on the channel. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump over here to my interview with Martha May on the Sudarium Christi and its relationship to the Shroud of Turin. Let's take a look. Martha May, thank you so much for joining me here today on the Gracious Guest Show.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk today.
Well, it's exciting because, anyone who has seen the previous sort of Shroud Overview video that I did will be happy, I think, because this takes us to a whole new level. And as I told you before we started recording, that video is just exponentially, above every other video I've ever had on my YouTube channel for years in terms of views, and not to put you on the spot too much, but I'm going to do it anyway. Just why do you think that is, just in general?
You know why I think it is? Because it's unexplainable. And I think that is the curiosity part of all of that. Everybody wants to be able to understand how that image was made on that burial cloth. And as we know, we don't know. Here it's been over 40 years since the Shroud of Turin research team went over to Turin in 1978, and with the single purpose to try to understand how that image was made. And they studied that cloth, right? They studied that cloth for 5 straight days, 24 hours a day, and they left there and came up with the conclusion they have no idea. They, to this day, we cannot replicate it. We can get close. We're starting to get better, but 40 years ago, they could not even come close to replicating an image like that. So I think that's really the reason. And I'm so encouraged that you've gotten that many viewers on that topic. Yeah. Because I think it's a great topic.
And I find, as a high school teacher primarily, I find that it's a topic that arrests everybody's attention and really makes them like, wait a minute, what did you just say? No, I couldn't have heard you right.
Right.
And to just, it's one of, I'd say absolutely right off the top of my head, in the top 2 or 3 in terms of potential subjects I can bring up that will completely, for sure, lock them in.
That's
and
wonderful.
Get their attention.
Right.
And just to kind of recap real quick, because we want to focus today primarily on the Sudarium, which a lot of people are not aware of. I was not till just a few years ago. But just to kind of recap, we're talking here about, generally speaking, not to spoil too much up front, but cloths that are purported to be, right, the burial cloths affiliated with Jesus's burial and then with his resurrection, cloths that are mentioned in the Gospels,
correct,
potentially, and of course the Shroud of Turin, which the previous episode was dealing with primarily, is I'm not going to give the exact inches here per se, but say 14 feet by almost 4 foot burial cloth. With the image of, very clearly, what appears to be a crucified man.
Correct.
And fits, down to every single wound, the wounds described that our Lord incurred during the crucifixion in the Gospels.
Absolutely.
This is a cloth, as you mentioned, that is mysterious. It's confounded people. It was venerated for centuries as his burial cloth. At least, we have a record of back to 14th century, maybe perhaps late 13th,
1360,
for sure.
1360, we can take it back to.
It's right, and so its existence before that largely came into question and was supposedly debunked with this carbon dating in the late 1980s after the 1978 Shroud of Turin research project, where STURP began to uncover all sorts of fascinating aspects to it. And the list you gave me, let me just read the list here quick, because myself and most of our viewers probably won't really know, and listeners, by the way, people listening on the podcast, not to rule you guys out. These are very scientific-y sounding processes that were done. We've got high resolution visible light photography, microscopy, X-ray radiography, infrared reflectance spectroscopy, ultraviolet reflectance fluorescence photography, visible narrowband and wideband photography, adhesive tape sampling, and optical transmission photography.
Great stuff.
So a lot of stuff by very, very astute, scientifically minded folks. Is that a fair abbreviation of what the STIRP project was doing?
They were the top scientists in the United States at that time in those categories of things that they did. And I give a lot of credit to John Jackson, who was one of the founding members of STIRP. And his whole thing was, at that time, he was in his 30s when he was putting this team together. And he made sure that he put people on that were in their 50s and well-established and well-credible in the scientific world when they went over there. He didn't want to be the young kid going over and then trying to tell everybody, well, this is what we found. He wanted the experts to come. Yeah.
Right. And we do have, Paul talks about that, right, in one of his letters to Timothy, about just encouraging him when they try to just rule you out because you're young.
Absolutely.
There is that.
Absolutely.
That's a long time bias, but by the same token, is John Jackson, he's from Colorado Springs.
He's in Colorado,
correct?
yeah.
He's got the center out there, right? And so basically they were setting out to look at the Shroud in depth. And as you have here, the first bullet I forgot to mention, the Shroud is the most studied, by far, I believe, the most studied religious artifact in the world.
Absolutely.
In history.
Absolutely.
Nothing has been subjected to more scientific scrutiny. And we see, again, this figure beaten, scourged, crowned with thorns, clearly marks from having carried a cross.
Correct.
Again, every little detail from the image. And the blood stains, of course, which is different. That's something I talked about in the first video. The image.
Right.
Can you maybe talk about that just for a second? The image and the blood are distinct. It's not blood that has produced this image, because people don't necessarily realize that.
That's right. The image, there is blood from the wounds, from the scourging marks, the crown of thorns, the pierced side. All of that generated blood. But the image itself is a brownish, very faint marking of the outline of this crucified man, the front and the back side, because of the way the cloth was wrapped around the body. And very, very faint. It is on the very top fibrils, not fibers, the fibrils that make up the threads of the yarn that weaves together to make the cloth. It is on the very top. In fact, if you could take a razor blade and run it across the top of the shroud, the image would disappear. That's how very faint and top of an image
consistent,
it is.
right? That whole image, it's the whole thing is just on that.
It's just on the top. So the blood is all the way through the cloth. So you can see the blood on both sides of the front and the back side, but the image is only on the side where the body touched.
And so, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but then because the image, for those who haven't seen it before, and we've had images of it in the previous video too, where it's elongated because the body was laid on basically one half of it, and the sheet was folded over, and then the body was wrapped. Right,
and it was folded over at the top of the head.
Right,
so the body lays in, and the cloth comes over like this. Right.
And so what we see is on one half of the cloth is the perfect photographic three-dimensional negative on a non-photographically sensitive material, right? On linen, the full front image on one side and the full back image, on the other side. But if you flip the whole cloth over, there's no image on that side of it at all, correct?
Right. No image on the back side, but the blood. You see the blood and the fluid on the back side.
The hair just went up on the back of my neck, and it's just
bizarre.
Amazing. It really is.
Yeah.
And so, and just again, because we want to, again, like I said, we want to get to the Sudarium thing, which is confusing to people. But so basically, we have just a word on the carbon dating, because there was all this interest in it. We had this carbon dating come out, and not to put too fine a point on it, but I've seen the footage. I've gone back several times, and I've done probably a little more study on this than your average Joe. Not as much as you, of course, but it seemed to me that when the team came out with the dating. Mm-hmm. That in that event and in years that followed, there seems to be still this a little bit of an arrogance, in my opinion, to it. It comes across as this done with that superstitious nonsense, like almost an excitement to disprove it very quickly. But then what are some of the problems we uncovered in, the dating and in terms of how they had actually conducted it? Because that's something I think people don't know about.
Right. And before the carbon dating was done in 1988, they considered doing that in 1978 as part of the STIRP study, but they chose not to because it is a destructive test. They would have to take a piece of the shroud and destroy it in order to do the carbon dating, and they did not want to do that. They were very, very careful to leave the shroud as they found it. So they had laid out protocols on what they anticipated would be the steps that they would need to go through to do the carbon dating correctly. And unfortunately,
the STIRP team did.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
okay, so they knew how they would do it if they did do it.
Correct. And I think, as you mentioned in your last video on the shroud, you talked about that it was supposed to go to 7 different laboratories, independent laboratories. That means that was 7 samples that would have to go to each of those laboratories. That ended up being 3. There's questions on how each of those did the test slightly different. But the most important and probably the biggest key thing is where they took the sample from. Okay, so if I can show you on the piece of paper, if this is the shroud, they took the sample from this top corner over here. And why that is such a problem is that every time they held the shroud up for any kind of public exposition, they did it holding these corners or all along the top side. They dangled it off of balconies. They did all of that stuff. And so it shouldn't surprise anybody that the shroud, that the carbon dating of that part probably went back to, many hands that touched it. Doesn't necessarily
mean contamination
mean
of the sample, in other words.
Correct.
Basically.
That's one part. Another part of that is that was also in that corner, that was a repaired section as well. And so they believed that they might have tested a piece of cloth that had been a repair patch that had been put in at some point in the past. No one knows exactly when. So it may indeed, now they don't know exactly for sure, but they have looked at the different fibers and the different weaving of the cloth, and they do believe that that might have been a repair patch and not the actual shroud itself that was tested. So those were probably the 2 biggest things that I think sort of make the carbon dating questionable.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and we won't get into all these details with this just now because we're going to shift gears here a little bit. But I had seen certain things I want to look into more myself about. We think about carbon dating, but those of us who, in my case, not necessarily being professionally speaking, up to speed on all the particulars of different scientific methods of dating, there's other ways to date stuff, right? Besides carbon dating.
Now there is.
And I've seen some reports on, everything from, and some of them may not be as precise, but, style of sort of textile dating, and using other things like I think argon or something. I mean, there's different elements that they can use apparently to try to date things as well, which is kind of interesting. That people have done as well.
I know one of the last tests that was done by an Italian group that was studying the age again of the cloth actually put it to, and I won't exactly remember the exact dates, but we'll say 200 BC to 100 AD, somewhere in that category. And, can't get any closer than that, can you?
That's in the ballpark.
That sure is. Sure is.
So that's the shroud, which of course, and if you want to see, I have it linked and everything below, and I'll have it at the end, the previous video, and some other links for you to check out. But take a look at the Sudarium now, which again, as we said, most people aren't aware of. And you recently have been able to actually see this yourself, which is very cool. And so, and I might, I don't know if I'll get to getting it in the video, like edited into the video here per se, but we'll have those links. So, like I said, all kinds of links and stuff below, goodies for people to check out more.
Wonderful.
So, where do you want to start with the Sudarium? Just maybe like an overview of what is this cloth?
Right. Let's start with that, right? What is it? Well, it's a small linen cloth or a napkin or a handkerchief. I don't know how you want to describe it. And again, depending on how it gets translated from the ancient languages, but it's approximately 34 inches by 21 inches. And it's actually, this is a replica of it right behind me. Okay, this is the cloth right here. And as you can see, the biggest difference when you look at this cloth versus what we talk about when we talk about the shroud, here's my man of the shroud right here, Jesus' face right here, is that this is a clear image of a man. This is bloodstains. Bloodstains and dirt and wrinkled. It's a wrinkled mess. Okay. So it's a very different cloth. But what makes it important is that it has very many similarities to the shroud, which we can talk about at great length. But just to say what the shroud is, or what the Sudarium is, it is, again, it is reported to be and believed to be the cloth that covered Jesus's face after he died on the cross, while he was still on the cross, and then and as kept on him until he was transported to the tomb. Okay.
And on that note, let me ask you a little bit about, if you want to just kind of explore this a little more for the audience, as far as, we're not necessarily experts in every little detail of Jewish burial rituals, of course, but there are certain things that, most people don't know anything about it, right?
Right.
You talk a little bit about how that would have gone from the cross, say, to the tomb, and what role this cloth potentially would have played, whether or not it's this cloth, which we believe, spoiler alert, we believe it is.
Spoiler alert, absolutely.
But how the cloth that is clearly mentioned in the Gospels, right? This napkin, this facial cloth. What's the idea behind this here?
The idea is that twofold, and very similar to what we do today. One of the reasons the cloth was put over Jesus's face was as a sign of respect, right? We want to respect the body that is passed. That's one reason. But again, one of the big things in first century Jewish funerary customs is that the blood, any blood that was connected to the body, is just as important as burying the body. So they wanted to capture as much blood as they could and bury it with the body, because it was a sort of the life-giving portion of the body as well. And so that's probably the biggest reason that the cloth was put on Jesus's face while he was still on the cross. Yeah,
that comes to mind actually. If there's that moment in the Passion of the Christ, which is just so ghastly. Obviously, the depiction of it. But I'm remembering now, after the scourging at the pillar in the movie, then when Mary is there, and Mary and Mary Magdalene, and they dabbing the blood up. Yeah, that's a nice connection there.
Orthodox Jews today still believe that, and in many areas with high populations of Orthodox Jews, that's what they do. If someone's hit by a car and are taken to the hospital, there, any passerbys that see that are mopping up the blood just in case. They are definitely. It's still definitely a very strong practice even today. Yeah,
I've heard of that even in some parts of the world where there might be some sort of religious violence, or like an act of terrorism or something, or a bombing or something like that, where they'll same thing.
Absolutely,
so that's
same thing.
So we still see that. So that has this origin, or it's definitely present at that time. So they wrap Jesus's face, not in the shroud yet, right? They take him down,
right?
Then they prepare the body, and then what do they do when they get to the tomb? Because that's an interesting little tidbit here, a little point. What do they do with the face cloth once he's ready for burial?
Off, okay. Right. And then they're going to place him in the shroud and wrap him in the shroud. And he's actually not only is the body around the shroud wrapped around the body, it's also tied. It's also wrapped around as well. So the cloth, that's what's key here. And if I can quote my John 20:6-7, if I can.
Yeah, please.
And so Simon Peter also came, following him, and entered the tomb, and he saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. And that's what we believe this cloth is. This is the face cloth that was laid and rolled up by itself in the tomb.
And we'll get to this a little more later, but obviously the implication would be that if indeed the shroud is as Father Spitzer likes to throw this out there, right? The idea of if it's a relic of the resurrection, a snapshot of the resurrection moment, which would have happened, through the burial shroud.
Right.
but not through the face cloth.
Exactly.
So in theory, that's, that would make sense that you would get the image on the burial shroud, but the matching blood stains on the cloth next to it, but not the image.
Right. That's exactly right.
Did I say that correctly?
That's
okay.
exactly right.
Okay.
We don't expect to see an image on the face cloth because it was already separated off the body.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Well, and then do you want to, in the notes you had here, because this might be a good place to just maybe share a little bit about, so the Sudarium, it's kept in Oviedo in Spain.
It's kept in the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, Spain.
Right.
It's displayed 3 times a year on Good Friday, on September 14th, which is the feast of the
Holy Cross?
Yes,
right. Okay.
Right. Exaltation of the Cross, and then on the octave of the feast as well. So on September, at the close on September 21st, and that's when I just saw it on September 21st. Of
That's what I was going to ask. So did you do? I forgot to ask you. Did you do the whole this Camino? Did you do that as part of it?
We did. We did a portion of the Portuguese Camino. We did the last 117 kilometers, something like that, into Santiago.
I got to do a whole episode on the Camino. That's a mental note.
Absolutely,
because that's a whole
it's
topic
great
in and of itself.
topic to do as well.
Yeah.
So we did that.
So what was the quote you said too about? You have it here. Yeah, that's
one
right.
of my favorite quotes. One of my favorite quotes.
It's a challenge for the pilgrims to go a little further.
Exactly, because the key is many people walk the way to St. James to go see the grave, the bones, the relics of St. James the Greater buried in Santiago. But the quote is, "He who goes to Santiago and doesn't go to San Salvador honors the servant and neglects the master." So I'm happy to report I did not neglect the master. We went there as well and saw the cloth at Oviedo as well. So.
And for what it's worth, I'm sure St. James, who quick catch up for those of you who aren't aware, there's 2 Jameses, right? This is the James that was the elder brother of John the Apostle,
right?
Which, shameless self-promotion, if you want a little narrative reflection and a reimagining of his final moments in his martyrdom, get my book, which is right over here, Return of the Lord, where I do that. But he's the first martyr, right? The first apostle who's martyred, and so this pilgrimage that honors his witness and his example of faith. I like that idea, though. Like, you're going to do all that and forget what he did all that for?
Exactly.
So what was that experience like, though, when you actually got to go see the Sudarium?
It was, I will tell you, when I saw the Shroud of Turin, it was, as I said to you before, life-changing for me. I had retired, and it was nice to be able to say I was done with my occupation, and I now had a vocation, and that vocation was using the Shroud of Turin to bring people to Christ. And I always tell people, once you see the shroud, you never pray the sorrowful mysteries the same ever again, because it is just, you are just looking at the Stations of the Cross right in front of you. It's just very touching. Right. So then to go see the Sudarium here just a couple of weeks ago, very similar, very short period of time. They only display it for about 10 minutes after Mass. So they bring it out for these 3 days a year, and you get 10 minutes to see it at the end of Mass. But again, what strikes you is the amount of blood that you see. And again, just a reminder of what our Lord did for us, so that we can be saved. So,
well, even just in your replica back there, I'm just thinking, my goodness.
Oh, yeah.
And how much, that's at the very end. That's, put on his head after he's dead.
Right.
That's not counting what dripped off and, or might have been wiped off other ways along the way. And to see, just the, head trauma, anyone who's dealt with that before, sports and stuff like that, that's no joke, and gosh, that's
right.
Incredible. And you had a note here too about, as far as evidence, you talk about, what's the evidence? There's all kinds of evidence, but it's not, I think it's important to look at the miraculous things that can sometimes be attributed to, proximity to our Lord in one way or the other. So you had some notes about that.
Many miracles. I highlighted a couple of them, but many miracles attached to the Sudarium for people who go and pray in front of the Sudarium, or back in the Middle Ages, before it was out on display at all. You know, they're just praying in front of the ark or the chest that it was in which it was kept. So,
right.
In 1415, a mute pilgrim who, after praying, could suddenly speak again. We had a woman who was free of demonic possession after praying in front of the chest that held the Sudarium. And then probably, again, in one of these, of course, it's our Lord taking care of these things. In 1934, Spain was in a civil war, and lots of bombing going on, lots and lots of really violent occurrences happening. Well, they bombed the cathedral in which and hit the holy chamber in which the Sudarium was held, and yet when they dug through the rubble, it's just there and totally unharmed. So of course,
I think something similar. Wasn't there someone who like threw a grenade, into the Our Lady of Guadalupe?
Oh yeah, right.
And it was
all
preserved.
of those,
So
right?
Yeah. So that's
same idea.
There's precedent.
How many fires has
goodness.
the Shroud of Turin been through?
Yeah. Well, and it's been interesting just to mention the shroud again. So, like, again, those who would ask, like, what's the evidence? What's the connection? What about, the shroud supposedly debunked, and then we're not so sure. How does the history of the Sudarium, which is far more established, how does that help us maybe connect these two?
And
stuff, you had some interesting stuff about that, and some scripture too.
That's one of the things that I think is so important, why this cloth is so important, because it provides justification and authenticity to the age of the shroud itself. There is so when we look at the Sudarium, it's well documented, much greater documentation on the Sudarium than there is the shroud. As I mentioned, we have historical documents of the shroud from about 1360 on to present day. But the Sudarium, we can actually go back as far as 631 AD, which is amazing, right, in and of itself. And one of the things...
And that's not disputed. Like, we know it's been there since then for this cloth you just saw.
Absolutely. Documents, well documented that this cloth has been in custody of people since 631.
Right.
That's pretty good right off the bat, right?
Well, yeah.
And what they believe...
There's things I wish I had that chain of custody on in my own possession in my own house. So, like, where are my keys?
This cloth, they believe that Joseph of Arimathea gave it to St. Peter and to St. Paul, and that between the two of them, they were the ones that had possession of the cloth after Jesus' resurrection. And
I don't think I ever thought of that, because it was his tomb, right? We learned in the Gospels it was Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, because he's getting ready. He's near the end of his life.
Exactly.
He has a tomb,
exactly,
a fresh cut tomb,
right?
That he's ready to be buried in, and he donates it to our Lord. By the way, that was a good investment. I like to joke, because he got it back, right? Like, or you'd think, although it seems like they didn't. They preserved it. I don't know if he was buried there or not. I've been in that tomb. Joseph of Arimathea is not there, so they might have put him somewhere else. But that's important, because so there is at least some scriptural evidence for some kind of transition of this cloth, or tradition of him, I should say, giving it to Peter and Paul.
Right. And
then you were going to mention the scripture. I misspoke there, but the tradition matching the scripture?
It does. So if we look at Acts 19, 11 and 12, so extraordinary were the mighty deeds God accomplished at the hands of Paul, that when face cloths or aprons that touched his skin were applied to the sick, their diseases left them, and the evil spirits came out of them. So, isn't that exactly what it sounds like? The face cloth?
I never thought of that,
sounds like it to me. So again, I believe scriptural basis for the Sudarium. Yeah.
And this there's an interesting note here, because I talked in the other video about some of the evidence that's like, a thumbs up for the shroud's authenticity include this reality of a recent discovery, relatively recent, obviously. In other words, things that wouldn't have been hoaxed, to then be found 800 years later, right? Like fossilized pollen grains, from Judea, some of which are only really around the springtime.
They only bloom in the
like
spring.
Easter time, right?
In Jerusalem, right.
And so, but you have some interesting points here, like some of those match up, but then there's some differences too, which is interesting in terms of the Sudarium having been in different places. So
Absolutely.
I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
So we believe from the best that we can piece together for the shroud, obviously in Jerusalem, and then we believe it went to Turkey, up in now present day Turkey, so Edessa, Constantinople, and then over most likely through Greece into France. And then shows up in Leary, France in 1360.
And that's like Crusader period, like
exactly.
during that
all
period, there's that exchange and they bring it back, right?
Right, all Crusader time, right. Now, and so what we see on the shroud is we see, as you mentioned, the pollen residue that shows pollen from plants that only bloom in the spring in Jerusalem on the shroud, as well as then pollen that we see from France and Turkey area as well from those plants. Okay. Now on the Sudarium, we also see the same pollen that we saw from the plants that bloom in spring in Jerusalem on the Sudarium. But then what we don't see is any pollen from France or Turkey, because this cloth was taken and put in this ark or this big chest, this wooden chest, and taken over to Alexandria, Egypt, when the Persians were invading. And then from there, a couple years after that, this is about early 600s, it goes across over into Seville, Spain, lower part of Spain there, southern Spain. Where again it was housed there for about 20 years or so, and then it goes up to Toledo, which is sort of the middle, and then the Moors start invading Spain, and they just keep pushing the cloth north, and that's how it ended up in the northern part of Spain in Oviedo, which is right on the coast of northern Spain up there. So that's kind of the track that we see, and then again what we see is pollen from Egypt. And then pollen from Spain, obviously, where it's
pollens
been.
that match that journey.
Pollens that match a journey.
Match up.
So we can
again,
see
you
the
see
difference.
The same thing with the shroud, and then you see a lot of pollens on it from around Turin because it's been there for so long, obviously. But it seems to match. It's neat that tells that story.
Isn't that great?
And by the way, shout out, I have to say it, you said Sevilla, shout out to my friend Pepe. I don't know if he's watching this, but he's from Sevilla. Now I have to share it with him because that's a big deal. He got a shout out. So,
excellent.
So yeah, well that's, and this is what's so cool though, is because this gets into, of course, maybe the big culminant, and we're doing great on time here because I think this is just amazing stuff. And people, I'm sure, are eating it up. So, because this, to me, this last section we have is some of the most fascinating stuff because we've talked about the properties, there's so much more, but some of the properties of the shroud, some of the properties of the Sudarium, some of the potential historical tracing of it and some of that evidence. But maybe the main event here, what are we looking at when we look at why we think these match? Because like you said, you can't just hold up that Sudarium to the shroud and say, oh, look, it's the same picture.
They look the same.
The blood might match, kind of, but what are we talking about here with like the actual, some of the forensic discoveries with very serious people here that have looked at this and seen some pretty alarming connections between these two?
So, I talked about the 1978 STIRP team, top scientists that were doing all that. Well, one of the people that helped bring all that about was a Monsignor Ricci, who was up in Turin at the time, and he was the one that was kind of helped make all that happen, both from the Vatican side and all the travel, all the good stuff that happened. So all of that, he was one of the key players. Well, one of the things that he noticed is after he had opportunity to really look at the shroud up close and personal, he also went to Oviedo and saw the Sudarium, and he was the one that noticed that the blood patterns looked very similar from what was on the Sudarium to the shroud. And so in he pretty much pushed to establish the Spanish Syndenology Center in 1988. And again, very similar to the 1978 STIRP studies, they conducted studies on the Sudarium.
Okay.
Same kind of, I won't
I
be
don't think
able
I
to.
knew that. Yeah, I have to
I'm
check
not
that
going to
out.
be
Yeah.
able to read all those great lighting sample tests that they did again. You did such a great job reading those at the very beginning that Stirp did.
Yeah,
but very similar.
spectroscopy. Yeah, that's I said it wrong.
Much of what they found, a lot of the results that they get is a result of all those different photography techniques that they use. So one of the
I would like to point. Sorry to interrupt. I want to point out, because a lot of this, as I understand it, just some of the documentaries and things I've read, a lot of this technology, like this is, again, just to reiterate, this is hyper sophisticated, top end technology stuff that some of which is used in the space program. Like this is the real deal for you science fans out there.
Absolutely.
Very serious people. This is not religious zealots, like who just want to prove a point, trying to trick some process. This is in some cases they would do blind samples on certain things where laboratories wouldn't know where it came from. So even if you had someone who had a religious agenda of some kind, so I just wanted to point that out again, that this is very scientifically minded study to try to understand this artifact, not so much people trying to prove something they want to believe. And quite frankly, I think a lot of the stories you hear of people converting or returning to their faith, which is, again, your main thing, we'll kind of end with that too, is a result of that. They didn't necessarily set out to prove something they already believed. They were just exploring a mysterious artifact. Is that a fair, sort of framing of it?
Absolutely. I'm going to jump back to the 1978 Stirp team that was put together. And I've had a couple of conversations with John Jackson specifically about that. He's a very devout Catholic man, but you know what? He made sure his team had a wide representation of Jewish people, atheists, agnostics, Protestants, Catholics. He pretty much wanted to make sure that there was no doubt that this was science-based, not a religious. This wasn't, we weren't going to do a religious study. It was a scientific study.
Sure.
And
follow the evidence wherever it leads.
Absolutely.
If we're rational,
absolutely.
If we're open to, hey, maybe indeed, oh my gosh, there is a God who became man. Like if it leads you there, great. But yeah, wow, okay.
Right. Now, as
so
a side
I interrupted a little bit there, but go on. I just wanted to ask about that. Yeah.
No, that's good. So as I said, the Spanish Syndenology Center then started doing studies on the Sudarium in 1988, and again, the lighting really helped. All those lighting studies that they did created a lot of the information that we have in terms of the findings, and that helps support the shroud. And by that I mean, I'm going to bring in my little sample over here.
Yes, this is. I've been waiting for this.
So this is.
It's like show and tell.
This is my show and tell. This is the head, and I've got to show you this way because when it looks this way, you don't know what I'm showing you. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if I can orient you, here's the right ear. Okay. And this is how the cloth was actually wrapped on Jesus's head, okay, as he was on the cross. So it was because of the way Jesus, when he died, as we know, his head was bent to the right and down, facing forward down, right?
Right.
And so when they tried to wrap the cloth around the face, they couldn't do it because of the way his head was bent down.
Right.
Okay.
And I don't know, like in terms of the timing, because they tried to do it pretty quickly, but I'm sure you're starting to battle with rigor mortis.
Absolutely.
And some of those kinds of,
That's exactly right. You're starting to battle the rigor process.
Yeah.
So what they did was they put the cloth on first, and then, as you can see here, back over here, they just folded it back over. So it's doubled back over and crosses the face. Then they bring it up and they tie it at the top in order to keep it on his head. Okay?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right.
Now, part of the other things
it's a very functional situation. You're just trying to deal with this terrible, one
of the other things that they found was down here at the nape of the neck, down at this area, they found a lot of the blood stains and puncture wounds down here, and they believe it's still from the leftover thorns that were from the cap of thorns that was put on Jesus's face, or head, I mean. Okay?
Wow.
So, from this, now you can kind of get a better idea of what we're looking at. If here's the nose, you can see from the mouth and the nose, you can see how all that blood is coming out as it comes out of as Jesus was still on the cross. Okay.
Right.
And so speaking of the blood, what we know for sure is that it is on both the shroud and the Sudarium. The blood type is AB, and it's from a male. And that's what's very interesting about that is that is very uncommon blood type for medieval European males. You wouldn't find AB blood type, okay? Now, you would find that from Middle Eastern people. Okay.
That's what I've heard that before. I didn't want to say it because I wasn't sure if I heard it right.
Right.
That it tends to have a higher likelihood or higher percentage among people in certain areas of like Palestine and stuff like that, which is interesting.
Exactly. So again, that supports our findings as well.
I've also heard that matches when they do blood tests on various Eucharistic miracles.
Absolutely,
is also AB.
Lanciano for sure. The one in Argentina, I can't remember what the name of it is. All of those AB blood type. Yep. Very good.
Yep.
Anyway, so in terms of the blood type, so when I show you this, how they know how to wrap it is because I'm going to set that back over here and go back up here and point to some of the wrinkles. You see all the wrinkles in this cloth?
Yes.
I don't know if you could see that well on this, but very wrinkled. They were able to use the wrinkles and computer programs, which just way over my head, but and they configure. That's how they determined how the cloth was wrapped on the head. Is they actually did programming to do that, which I think is pretty spectacular.
I think they've done stuff like that with the shroud too.
They did.
The same kind of where you can kind of
how you pull it up and all that. It's good stuff.
Well,
a lot of people are a lot smarter than I am. I just get to talk about all the good stuff.
We're just passionate. You're passionate. Yeah. Well, and let me ask you too here, because you have some of the last notes you had on this section, and I thought I heard. I thought the number 124 was in my head, but it looks here it's definitely over 120. Do you want to just talk a little bit about? Because this is one of the most fascinating things.
The correlation
I've you think about the blood, or you learn about this. You read some stuff about the shroud. You kind of know about the blood and the blood matching, but I never thought of this till just in the last year, hearing a lecture on it, probably from Father Spitzer, who's so awesome on this topic. But
that's great.
The other liquid perfusions matching.
Right.
Because, when you're in a tormented kind of situation like this, you're not just dealing with blood, you're dealing with nasal fluid, you're dealing with other fluid, and so you want to talk about that a little bit.
I would like to.
And that's not visible.
Right.
necessarily.
Right. And this is good. I get to use my show and tell of my face here.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we look at the face of the of Jesus on the shroud, one of the things that's very pronounced is what is called the epsilon on the forehead. Okay, or I call it the inverse 3, whatever you want to call that. That is a very pronounced thing. It's funny that in paintings that they have done throughout the years, that is turned into a hair curl on the forehead instead of a wound mark. Okay, interesting just how those kind of things have morphed over the years. But we know that to be a puncture wound from the cap of thorns that was on Jesus's head. And it provided that on the shroud, it is a definite blood stain. You can see the red mark of that epsilon mark on there. It is also on the Sudarium, but it's in serum form. So it's when the blood separates, when the red blood cells separate, and what's left is the clear plasma.
Right.
It still leaves that mark. We just can't see it to the naked eye. But again, on all those scientific tests that they've done and the different lighting that they showed, they can see that same mark on the Sudarium as well. So that's, again, what a match. What a perfect match. How rare would that be that it would be any other cloth
Yeah.
than the Sudarium wrapping the same person. The shroud.
Right. And so in other words, if these two cloths were on the same body, which it's increasingly clear that they were, the shroud's not a medieval hoax.
Right.
Exactly. Just from that.
That's exactly it. So when we can, and what we've been able to prove, I believe that what they've totally been able to prove is that if the Sudarium covered Jesus's body and the shroud covered Jesus's body, then indeed the shroud is not a medieval hoax, because it was, it goes back to at least documented 631.
Sure. Well, and what's so cool about that is even like, imagine there is no image on the shroud.
Right.
And it's just a cloth with bloodstains on it that doesn't have this insane, like, I can't comprehend what I'm looking at, X-ray image of a human being on it.
Right.
It's just bloodstains. And you find out that they match. That, I mean, I'm not a forensic expert. From what I've heard from many who are, you've got plenty of proof there to convict. If this is in a courtroom, case closed, basically.
Right.
That I forget what the exact number is. I heard somewhere that if you can get, I think it's like 10 matches. This is just what I've heard somewhere. But 10 matches, in some sort of like murder trial or something,
10 correlations.
10 correlations, that's sufficient for conviction.
Right.
And if I'm looking at this correctly, we've got these 70 on the front and
50 on the back.
Am I reading that right?
Yes.
Over 120 correlations between these two cloths, just
Isn't
on
that
the
wild?
head.
Yes, and right, and just
that's
think
all
about
we've
that.
got, the
That's
face cloth and the head,
the
right?
face, right? It's just from the
Yeah.
face cloth, not the entire cloth that is the Shroud of Turin. That's pretty amazing, right?
Yeah, that's just astonishing.
Yeah.
And all of this is, like I said, we're going to include a couple of links and stuff below, for people to check out for sure. But I'm never in a hurry to end any conversation on this. But I'm looking. I want to make sure I give you some time here to any just big picture stuff. Any other things you want to bring up? Any other curious aspects of this, or just even your passion for this topic and kind of why it's so important.
Well, again, why it's so important is because I do believe it totally validates that the Shroud of Turin is an authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Now, we'll never be able to prove that because there is no official documentation, but that's where faith comes in. And as we know, science and faith are not mutually exclusive of each other in the Catholic Church.
Right.
In fact, it's exactly opposite. And I think that's what we see here more and more. That's one of the things I've really appreciated over my last 3 years of really in-depth study on both the Shroud and the Sudarium, is that how much science supports the growth of our faith. It's just amazing in terms of that. So.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, do you have any just kind of maybe wrapping up for now? Any recommendations for anybody, like where you think is a good place for them if they're interested more in this topic? Like other than the links I have below that I sent you, anything else that might just for curiosity. One thing I have noticed, and maybe you can speak to this, I haven't really been able to find a lot in terms of books yet. I'm sure they'll be coming out, but from what I found, a lot of it, the more official stuff, a lot of it's in Italian. Or there's
sorry,
we got our guest appearance. That's
guest
awesome.
appearance by cat.
That will drive up views if nothing else, just because of an unexpected pet appearance. That's a big thing on YouTube. For those listening and not seeing, there was just a cat appearance, so you missed it. That's why you should go subscribe to the YouTube channel.
There you go.
So, but yeah, no. So any
it's funny.
Recommendations
In the when in the cathedral of San Salvador that hosts this, they had one book in English. Everything else is in Spanish. I bought the Spanish book. I can't read it, but I bought it.
But you have it.
I bought it mainly because it has the pictures and all of the science. It has the pictures of all the testing that was done through the Spanish Synodology Center. And so it's a huge book just on that. But you're exactly right. It's very difficult at this point to find anything, in English that you can. But I'm hopeful. And then I will tell you
English. Oh, I was just going to say English-speaking scientists out there who are into photomicroscopy.
Exactly.
All those things we mentioned
Step
earlier.
it up,
Get out there and
people.
study the Shroud. We need you.
That's
Some of us
right.
we're not as gifted in languages as others. So
That's
go on,
right.
I'm sorry.
No, and then I would tell you that the source of all good things connected with the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium is shroud.com. And this
Yes.
is the website that is by the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, known as STERA, and it's run by Barry Schwartz. And it is the repository of all the scientific findings, all the white papers, any of the latest news
Sure.
on the Shroud and the Sudarium. It can be found there. And in fact, he just did
that's
a
the
fallout
official,
update. It is.
right.
It is very
Yeah.
scientific, great
Awesome.
stuff. So,
Awesome. Martha May, thank you so much for coming on today. I feel like we're just getting started. I want
Me
I want to
too.
go into so much more, but this is great. Great resources for people. Thank you so very much for coming on today.
Thank you very much, Mike. I've really appreciated the time, and I encourage anybody that has the opportunity, go see it.
Awesome. Hey, God bless you.
God bless you.
I don't even know what to say. It was just an awesome opportunity. I learned a lot. I was blown away, as I mentioned in the interview with Martha. So many resources, so many links. I just have a few of them for you guys here below in the show description. So please check this out. Go dig in a little bit more for sure. I really want to ask you guys, shameless self-promotion here in one sense, but truly, if you like this content, please share this far and wide. I think this can really have a powerful impact on people to be able to kind of meditate on this stuff and go deeper and really see just how much evidence there is to hopefully generate a really thoughtful and profound conversation about important things, about implications if this is indeed that we're talking about here, if these are indeed burial cloths of Jesus. It would logically make sense that they would bear certain characteristics, certain evidence. Okay, the Christian faith is not irrational. It is not unreasonable. It is the perfect meeting place of faith and reason, unlike any other system that has ever been proposed by mankind. Okay, this is real. This impacts people. This causes people to meditate, if nothing else, on the passion of our Lord. Right? We can't 100% prove 100%, certainty that this is the burial cloth and the facial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, of our Lord. But man, follow the evidence, guys. Let's have this conversation. Let's take a deeper look at this, right? And so please share this far and wide. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe to The Gracious Guest. Lots of great stuff, more and more great stuff here. Some great conversations coming up, all of it relevant. If not for you directly, surely for someone you know. So please share, spread this stuff far and wide, subscribe, like, all that stuff that makes this more readily available for people. So God bless you guys. I'm Mike Creevy. TheGraciousGuest.org is the website. Until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.